Okay, thank you. And due to the presentation by Dr. Canto, I will be also skipping a lot of slides, because he has actually covered those particular slides. And then I would definitely focus on policy actions that have been taken to curb some of these different types of IFFs. And I will do a case study of a multinational company that has a mining operations in Ghana, as well as an example of an amendment to an agreement that is in the oil and gas industry in Ghana. So having said that, just by way of introduction, Africa and other developing countries are rich in mineral resources, including oil and gas, and then a wide variety of those minerals. However, the paradox is that they are absolutely poor, or they live in abject poverty. So there is probably a missing link why in the midst of abundance there is so much poverty. And we will try to find out some of the reasons why some of these things do happen, which of course goes down to the illicit trade, and also illicit financial flows. So much as you said about this. So like I said, I would skip all the slides and then go straight to the area. But I just want to talk about, before I go into the extractives, I just want to talk about the issue about illegal logging of timber resources. For example, in Ghana, there was this total ban on rosewood. Rosewood is a rare species of wood. Whereas the ban was enforced, container loads of these same products were being logged and then shipped out of the country. So these are practical examples of illicit financial outflows. Same goes for illicit fishing, where pair trawling and other things go on, even though they may be prohibited. They are the norm, and these things keep on going day in, day out. And so it's a whole gamut of people who are involved, including politically exposed persons and all that. But I'm just going to leave that for now, and then maybe, like I said, due to lack of time, I will move to the areas that really talks about the extractives. Now, if you look at the entire extractive value chain, from licensing to exploration to the mine development, into production, into storage, transportation, and marketing, processing, validation, even at the decommissioning stage of a mine, each of these steps are prone to illicit financial outflows of the country. And you'll see to some of these things as I go. And for example, in most jurisdictions, minerals are deemed to be state properties that are vested in the president for and on behalf of the citizens. And so if you vest a whole natural resources in the in one person, that person probably assumes that kind of power, or maybe over that particular means. And I have had I just recently drafted the ECOWAS Model Minerals and Mining Development Act. I had a chance to look at all the fiscal regime or money regimes in all the ECOWAS countries. I realized that they all have that kind of provision that the minerals are vested in the president. So in drafting that, I amended that to take it away from the sole vestment of that kind of natural resource in just the president. And in some jurisdictions, the licensing are done even at the presidency. There's no autonomous body that is involved in that. So clearly, there's and they don't even it's based on first come first served basis. They tend to discourage tendering processes, which would rather lead to much more economic gains as far as the exploration and the development of the mineral resources are concerned. And so if you look at most of the jurisdictions, their laws make it sad that the minister responsible for the grant of the minerals has wide discretionary powers. And when that happens, it is subject to some form of abuse. So the proposal is that some of these discretionary powers will need to be taken off. And that has led to the recommendation that beneficial ownership of some of these multinational companies that are operating in these countries need to be disclosed. Now, if you look at the EITI, or that's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a voluntary initiative which is signed onto by most resource-rich countries. The focus has always been on mining, oil and gas, but it does exclude forestry, fisheries, and other natural resources. That, I think, is a gap which needs to be filled, because so much resources, wood products, are living, just to the point that the forest cover, vegetation cover, have been so depleted so fast that it's all contributing towards what? Global warming. And again, the rate of growth of tree planting has not been able to match up with the deficit that is due to this overexploitation, illegal overexploitation of these forest products. Now, in some of the policy actions that probably will be needed to curb some of these things include deployment of online mineral title administration systems to ensure that transparency becomes the order of the day, to actually reduce the amount of human interface with the people. And one thing that I've also realized is that most of these resource-rich countries do not have an independent laboratory or assay for their mineral exports, and they depend solely on what the multinationals tell them is the purity of that mineral so that they are exporting. Now, if, for example, a company is exporting 100 kilograms of gold, and then the purity is 95%, and it declares, oh, this gold is 100 kilos, everybody can weigh it, but then the purity is 90%. Straight away, for every 100 kilos, 5 kilos is unaccounted for. And that has gone on in many countries, and it still goes on in many countries. And it was actually recently that through a World Bank project, we have an assay lab which gives us an independent assay value, and that we have realized that there is so much which has been lost over the years, which now could be accounted for. Now, if you look at some of this, and again, you would see that that's why when there was a ban on small-scale coal mining in the country, at the time the ban was enforced, when the lab came up on stream in 2017, a ban on small-scale mining, both legal and illegal, was enforced, and yet gold production from the small-scale sector doubled in that year when gold was. So the question is, where is the gold coming from? So these are some of the things that can easily be conduit for people taking illicit funds out of the country. So we are proposing that some of the policy gaps could be developing a multi-agency mineral revenue task force, which would audit all corporate tax payments, mineral royalties, especially when they are for the sliding scale over the floor and then the maximum. If you leave these things to the revenue authorities, mining and oil and gas is such a complicated area that if you don't have the right knowledge in mineral economics or in maybe energy economics, and it's purely tax experts, they have a way of going around them and paying their taxes. So developing fiscal models which you can subject every mining company to, it's probably the way to go. And I think that it is also important to share the data with the revenue authorities, so that appropriate capital gains tax and other related taxes could be obtained. Now, if you look at the depreciation schedules of most fiscal regimes in most of the laws, it makes way for isolated depreciation of capital assets. Usually, they over a 5-year period, most of these heavy equipment are fully depreciated with a zero book value. But the question is, what happens? Most of the multinationals have operations in other countries. Chances are that this equipment may be moved to another operation elsewhere, perhaps refurbished, painted, sprayed, whatever. and it comes as an initial cost to another, operation entity, and again is written off. And this cycle can go on as many times as one would think. So it is very important that the necessary steps are taken. And I've seen in some jurisdictions where, for example, expenditures in the mining or oil and gas sector, for example, should be wholly, exclusively, and necessarily incurred in the production of that good. But the question is, how are we able to monitor the, wholly, exclusively, and the necessary incurred? So what happens is that most of the capital items may not be, required, because they know that they can be written off within a 5-year period. It will not be a necessary, equity to purchase. They are purchased, and then what happens? Just to create, carry forward losses into subsequent years, or to reduce, taxable, income. So these are some of the issues. And again, of course, the dividend policy. In some jurisdictions, some of these, the host nation is not represented on the boards of these companies. How would they know when, dividends? How would they know what happens in the boardroom? These are some of the issues, and it can be coded. So the proposal could be that instead of relying on dividend payments, you could probably have legislation a percentage of net cash flow. So once that is done, then you could be able to. But I've also realized that most of these multinationals are registered in the tax havens. I mean, when they are applying for all these mineral rights and all these oil blocks, you look at the documents and they're all registered in that. What is the motivation for doing that? The motivation is your guess is as good as mine as well. I mean, it's to make sure that they get as much as they can from these operations. And I think that this is very important that laws are revised to check some of these things. I have actually spoken about the increase in gold production at the time that there was a ban in responsible, and gold production from the small scale sector alone accounts for about 40% of total gold production in Ghana, more than 1.6 million ounces of gold, and that's got a lot of money. So if it's not well tracked, you can realize that so much is being taken out without the relevant, So I just want to probably skip this one and go into the fact that if in having this, if countries are going to, get these investments into the country, more often than not, they go through what they call petroleum agreements or mining investment agreements and all that. And when those are negotiated not on fair terms, or if those agreements are unconscionable, and then the basis for which they are unconscionable, I mean, you all know that it is a predetermined, it's an a priori, determination that is what they want. So if you have a very, unquestionable agreement which would suffer so much, in my view, it is just a way of trying to have a legal, way of taking money out, but with an underlying, illegality, because of the initial, an agreement which are signed, without due cost to, or which even at loss or ousts most of the, financial regime or the fiscal terms that actually operate in the country. I'll just cite an example of an oil company which just got its agreement amended. I mean, it took over a block in, maybe an operation in, let's say, in 2006, and last year there was an amendment which came from the company, and the company amendment was that, their operations have changed, and therefore they needed to have, a change in, the way they do things. And some of the terms that are introduced include having the same meaning for a production area as a development area. We do know that the two don't mean the same thing. A production area is not the same as a development area. But some of these things have their net effect of actually ensuring that funds are taken out. And again, for example, if you look at some of the amendments, the Ministry of Energy could obtain or should assist in getting other environmental permits. That is, I mean, you cannot enter into an agreement which will have a binding effect on the third party. I mean, privity of contracts. I mean, no, it's probably not. So these things are very important. I will just cite some of these things to show that this very badly negotiated agreement, for maybe obvious reasons, have a net impact on if I call it illicit financial flows. I will go straight to a case, due to lack of time. I'll go to a case study of a money investment also, which was negotiated originally, and that has terms and conditions and clauses which are completely inimical to the which actually outs most of the tax laws. For example, if you are having a stability period, a stability period means a stability period which has a fixed term. If it's for a 10-year period, it should be for a 10-year period. But in this instant case, it was indefinite. So long as the leases exist, by the stability period is as good as anybody that anybody can think of. And it also applies to future money leases that the company might get. So you actually negotiate terms which apply automatically to things that you don't even have as of now. So, and again, for example, taxes and duties, they were exempt from them so long as the leases remain valid. Issues related to corporate income tax were, would not exceed a certain amount, or maybe would not exceed a certain percentage, and it includes all kinds of extensive deductions and all that. So these are, but in fact, thankfully, these have been revised and then amended through a 3-year-long, renegotiation. But if you have a very bad investment agreement, there is so much little that you can claw back, because it's going to be a matter of give and take. You have to, trade off certain terms for others as well. So the point I'm making here is that, so the question is, if you look at the original investment agreement vis-a-vis the revised one can determine clearly how much funds that have been lost over a long period of time. And when this revised agreement was, concluded, the company paid $27 million to the country at the time that the revised agreement was signed. So that's money that probably, that will have to be revisited and plowed back into the economy. So these many more have been outlined in the case study that I have, but I think that the presentation is available, and I'm sure that anytime I thought that, or maybe during the question time, I could take more questions on that. So with that, and again, there's one critical thing was that the agreement initially, did not make provision for payment of any local taxes at all. And that, when I got in here, the first thing I was going to pay was the tourist tax, even at the hotel, and I had to pay. But here, no local taxes and duties were paid. So these are very critical things that we need to consider whenever we are, and can be ways that funds can be, actually siphoned out of a country. So, given that, I'll just say that illicit trade and then illicit financial flows are the biggest threat to the achievement of the targets and the SDGs. And I think that if we don't take pragmatic steps to deal with them, our attainment of the SDGs may be a mirage, and we may come 2030, we might meet here again, just as it happened to the MDGs, to be talking about the same issues. But because we need to take bold steps and then to make sure that we can curb all these things and look at all the avenues through the entire value chain of the initiatives. I thank you for your attention.
I think you raise an issue in your discussion around what you see as clauses, terms, and conditions that are inimical to development. You raise the issue of the fact that we do need to grasp that illicit financial flows are flows that are illegitimate. They are based on the abuse of power and on societal harm. And even if you may find that in one particular clause there's a legality that has been associated with that flow, it may well still be something that causes huge societal harm and can be seen as something that's been created from abuse of power. And really the question is, can we revisit those things that which have legalized those very flows, because indeed they should be considered illicit. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Kathy to step up. Kathy Nicolaou-Manias has more than 8 years' experience working on illicit financial flows. In 2011, she headed up a research policy unit at the Financial Intelligence Center in South Africa, where she provided policy advice to the Minister and Deputy Minister of Finance on illicit financial flows and also the illicit economy. Her work has informed the G20's developing work group agenda on commercial tax evasion and that component of IFFs, and she has also estimated trade misinvoicing and trade-based money laundering for 5 African countries. She continues to provide strategic and technical advice to numerous African countries and to the UN Economic Commission for Africa to measure the SDG indicator 16.4.1. Her work has also included developing online courses on AML and CFT. She's also designing a course for one of the largest South African banks on the same subject, and she has just completed a risk assessment on the money, value and transfer service sector in South Africa for the South African Reserve Bank, which will be an input into South Africa's national risk assessment and the 2019-2020 FATF mutual evaluation for the country. Kathy has a Master's of Commerce in Economics. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Taking on from Richard's presentation, South Africa has probably the largest natural resource of gold in the world, is the 5th largest producer, and its mining houses pay, how much tax do you think, corporate tax? Zero. They actually pay 0, and they have assessed losses due to, as Richard explained, the depreciation. They're allowed to gather or collect these and accumulate these assessed losses, and as a result of that, they'll probably never pay tax for at least another 10 years as a result. So just to give you an idea of illicit flows as we start. That one, cool. Right, so Fernando, thankfully, has done quite a bit in this, but I've been in the space for about 11 years, and when we look at this specifically, if you take, this is the original GFI presentation of what they understood illicit flows to be. So it has a corruption component, which we know is the largest lever and enabler in developing countries. And then it's obviously got the criminal activities, which is all your drugs and human trafficking and guns, etc. And then we have commercial tax evasion, or what we call trade misinvoicing, abusive transfer pricing, etc. And when you start to unpack the story, what we found when we were working at the Financial Intelligence Center is that the bulk of the problem actually is a trade story. And so I'm going to try and explain why we look at it from a trade perspective and why illicit trade and the linkages with illicit financial flows are such an important story that needs to be told. So this is actually just the definitions that we're currently working with that the task force has put together. And if you look at the 4 areas, basically the tax and commercial practices and illegal markets really is the trade bit that we're talking about at the end of the day. And we're currently working with this definition specifically to try and estimate illicit financial flows for various African countries, and we started with a pilot study in Nigeria. And what was interesting in the working group that we had with Nigeria is that as we started looking at, so we just had a little design thinking brainstorming workshop, and we actually started to uncover that there's almost like a thread between these 4 components. You can't really separate them. So what we found is corruption is a really huge issue in Nigeria, and it's actually linked to commercial and tax practices, and that in turn is linked to some extent to the illegal markets, which in turn tends to feed some of the theft type and terrorism. So you can almost see a little thread that's being woven between the various activities in this particular space. Obviously in Nigeria, we're specifically interested in the tax and commercial practices, and we'll be focusing on how we measure it. But in order to understand that, you cannot really separate the trade story out of that. So I have a very long story. When I first joined the FIC in 2011, on day 3, I went to a workshop which was actually hosted by GFI specifically, which looked at illicit financial flows. So it was a little bit of a baptism by fire. And while I sat there, I quickly cobbled together this little graphic, which kind of has stuck and makes a lot of sense, at least to me. And I think the important thing to remember is that when we were looking at trying to understand the illicit economy, you need to think about the productive sector, and you also need to think about the money sector as well. So specifically, you can see you can produce stuff illegally or in the illicit economy on the left side, and you can also produce it in the licit economy or formally. And that's on the right side. And that's whatever is produced in the economy. So that's the generation of goods and services. And then what can happen is, generally, if it's produced in the illicit economy, it would have to filter through into the illicit money market and then hopefully washed and laundered and enter the licit money market. And so then it's apparently clean, and then you can use it and do whatever you want with, and then we'd see you'd buy big assets, fancy cars, artworks, etc. If it's produced licitly, then what happens is it enters into the licit money market. But then if you are going to transfer it illicitly, so you're either going to undertake trade misinvoicing or transfer mispricing and do some dodgy stuff around that, it automatically moves into what we call the illicit money market, and very often that goes cross borders. The important thing to understand in this space is that we also need to try and follow not just the money, but follow the value. And very often transactions actually take place, although there are cross-border transactions in inverted commas, there's been no transfer of money that's actually taken place across borders. And that's typically the informal financial system like a hawala. So that actually adds to the complexity of this particular space. But the important thing to remember is that we've got to separate the illegal and illicit side from the licit and legal side. But then we also need to try and understand it from the real sector and the productive sector of the economy, and that's where the actual trade takes place, which is the production of goods and services, whether they're illegal or legal. And then obviously there's the money market side of it. So the illicit trade actually sits on the top side. It's a real sector production. You've either produced drugs or whatever you're doing illegally, or you've got a legal production that you're stealing and you're taking across the country. So we try and understand it in terms of these two elements. But the monetary side is really the flow side. So I'm going to leave you with a little story. When we were working on the narcotics sector in South Africa, we had come across a story where there was a whole batch of drugs that had washed up on the west coast of South Africa. And so there were these huge bales of drugs, and in them, they just had a GPS tracking device. So what the drug lords are doing is they put these huge bales together, and they use the South African west coast water currents to actually ship their drugs. And when it gets to the coast in South Africa at Cape Point, basically where the two seas merge, it creates a little bit of a whirlpool, and so the people go out in their little boats, they collect the drugs, and basically they distribute it that way. So that particular night, there was a storm, and unfortunately these drugs washed up onto the shores, and that's how we discovered them. But what it does tell us is that drug lords and producers of narcotics actually factor in the loss of their consignments. And we know that they're properly factoring to their price about 50% of the consignments that are lost. But actually, we only capture about 1% of the financial flow linked to that. So this is the story of you've caught the trade, the actual illicit trade, but you haven't seized the money linked to it. And actually, you don't even know who it belongs to, because a GPS tracking device is not linked to a particular shipping company or a logistics company. You just don't know who the owner of that is. So moving on, what I've done is I've tried to separate this by thinking of it in terms of the productive and the monetary side of the economy, and thinking about legal and illegal. So let's say we have a commodity that's produced legally, and there's over or under invoicing, which means it's an illicit transfer. So at the end of the day, it transfers into the illegal or illicit money side of the economy. And generally in this case, because of the work that tax authorities do, we'd be able to see both sides of that transaction. So that's a good thing. Sometimes, though, we've got goods that have been seized illegally, the drug story that I gave you an example of, but at the end of the day, we don't actually know where that money is, so we can only see one side of that transaction. Similarly, we've got cash that's actually seized at the airport, and a lot of authorities tell you, we've seized a lot of cash. Very similar story, we don't know what the actual production is related to that particular transaction. So in that case, again, we're only seeing one side of the story. So when we're measuring illicit financial flows, we actually need to think about, is this a transaction on the production side, and where is the financial link to it? So I think we need to consider these, and often there's a bit of double counting when we do the measurement in this particular space. So moving on, I've been working in the space for quite a while, and very often, and I think Fernando did quite a nice job of explaining the definitional side of it. And what's important about this side is to realize that there are a lot of players in this space. So very often illicit financial flows has actually come from the capital side of the literature, and it's actually linked to capital flight, which is where it actually started. So it's part of the economic and sort of financial DFI story. On the accounting side and on the tax side, we see a lot of transfer pricing and trade mispricing. We've got the trade story, which is all the trade mispricing, illicit trade that's come through. And then we've also got something called trade-based money laundering, which is the money laundering AML, CFT side of the story. And very often we're looking at the same problem, but from just a different disciplinary lens, and we're trying to use different tools to try and understand the problem. And the reason this slide is up is just so that we can understand that there are a lot of players in this space. Tax authorities play here, law enforcement agencies play here, your Department of Finance is here, etc. So they play a crucial role in this, and that's going to be the secret to try and tackle illicit trade and illicit financial flows, is to make sure that all of these parties come together. So just a little bit on some of the numbers. We looked in South Africa at illicit drugs, supposedly estimated at 12.8 billion. Illicit alcohol estimated by SA Breweries about 1.1 billion. Fisheries about $23 billion. We don't really look at the issues around food, but we picked up illicit inflows. Counterfeit goods and piracy is probably the biggest one, and other than actual seizures, there's little focus of it on the ground. There's some interesting work that's been done by the Kustar Center, which is looking at anti-piracy using blockchains as a way of trying to stop piracy in the digital media space. Illegal logging we don't really touch, although it's a huge problem for South Africa. Pharmaceuticals is estimated about 61.2 million outflows. Pesticides, it's our estimate, but not really a key focus area. The big one in South Africa is actually precious metals and petroleum. We see massive outflows as a result of that. And very often we tend to underplay the size of illicit outflows in the gold and gems sector. Trafficking in persons is a growing problem in South Africa. We did a study with the ILO, interestingly enough, and discovered sweatshops run by Chinese firms in the KZN province, where we've got 700 people on a shop floor being treated very badly. It's a huge occupational health and safety risk. We've estimated wildlife, the horn industry, at about $785 million. And the big one that's interesting there is when we were looking at illicit financial flows specifically, we found out that 75% of our problem was in a miscellaneous category, and that miscellaneous category basically is illicit or non-monetized gold going to China. I'm going to skip over this. How good are you in terms of addressing illicit financial flows? Well, you're only as good as your neighbor, basically. So if your neighbor is not as good as you, you're going to have huge issues, as you can see in South Africa, where there's huge cross-border crime at the end of the day. On the actual measurement side, what we've done is come up with an approach that has a sort of low capacity, medium, and very high capacity approach to try and measure the problem. So for developing countries that have very little resourcing allocated to it, we'll use sort of more national accounts, and if you have a lot of data available at a company level, that's your option C. I'm not going to really touch on the data issues because I think Fernando's done a really good approach to that. So my last two slides really are, how do we tackle this going forward? Well, fixing the data is the biggest problem in this space and making sure we can get data readily available. The introduction of a unique consignment reference for me is really the big ticket item at the end of the day. Using a benchmark pricing tool, which you will introduce into a risk engine for tax authorities, is a huge tool that can be used, which complements the unique consignment referencing. The bilateral exchange of customs information that actually complements the tax and mimics the tax space as well is a big step in the right direction. A social network analysis where you actually identify who the perpetrating enablers are, shipping companies, logistics companies, bankers, lawyers, etc., is critical, because if they're doing it for one particular case, they're doing it across the board. Cooperation, as I said in that previous slide, you need to get tax authorities, customs, central banks, your FIUs, and your law enforcement authorities and judiciaries to actually work together to tackle this problem. So you can't actually look at it from one lens. Risk assessments are critical, and typologies are a huge way of trying to flag risky perpetrators. FIUs need to move into a space of analyzing trade, training and capacity building, and just understanding the ability to navigate this language and what it means is critical. You need the standard money laundering toolkit is a very powerful one, so know your customer, enhanced customer due diligence, country by country reporting, and beneficial ownership are really some of the most powerful tools in this space. Eventually moving into big data analytics is the long and the short of the story. So that's it, Penny.
Thank you, Kathy. I think the very important point that you raised in your very detailed and useful presentation is this real call for the need for us to share information. I mean, it comes out of Richard's presentation as well, that unless we have cooperation between different authorities, both nationally and internationally, it's always going to be a thing where we're just simply plugging little bits of gaps, seizing one factory at a time. Tom, I see that you've already had some way of an introduction through Kathy's presentation. Tom Cardamone is the president and CEO of Global Financial Integrity. He is responsible for the strategic planning and promotion of organizational goals and policy positions to key audiences, including high-level government officials and multilateral institutions. He leads the promotion of GFI's Trade Risk Assessment Database, GF Trade, which enables developing country customs officials to better detect instances of trade misinvoicing in order to capture more domestic resources. Throughout his career, Tom has served as an analyst, consultant, project director, and executive director to different non-profit organizations. His advocacy has spanned many appearances in US-based television and media networks. He's delivered remarks on various policy issues to the UN and to the OECD, and has testified before the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you to UNCTAD and TRACIT for the invitation to speak to you today. There were a lot of comments made yesterday and on this panel this morning that I had in my presentation as well, so I'm going to flip through some of these slides fairly quickly. And then I will focus primarily on some of the numbers we've come up with. I'll go over a brief case study, talk about some policy initiatives that have been put forth, and talk a little bit about our risk assessment tool. GF Trade has been mentioned already. Primary types of illicit flows, basically we look at these in the context of corruption, commercial and criminal sources, and the relationship between illicit trade. You can see on that bottom line, illegal trade and trafficking as part of a transnational crime component. The various actors involved in legal trade, organized criminal gangs, terrorist organizations, non-state actors, usually working alone, but sometimes also working in concert to move product across various areas. The essential point here is that it is profit-driven, and many times these are crimes of convenience. If I am moving narcotics, I could have probably also moved guns and antiquities over the same routes, and similar statement could be made for fishing. That ships can be used, or boats can be used for human trafficking as well. In 2017, GFI did a meta-analysis of various types of illegal trade. These are the 11 areas we looked at. And basically, we did a deep dive into various research that had been done by research centers, nonprofit organizations, governments, multilateral institutions, in each one of these 11 categories. And then actually read all the footnotes and the source material to see where they got their data, to try to come up with a credible range of value for different types of illegal trade. Now, the pricing on the right column is the estimated retail value, and the highlighted ones, line items, have to do with legitimate business that have illegal components to it. So we heard a lot about counterfeiting yesterday. This covers everything from medicines to sunglasses. So it's understandably a massive and the largest source of illegal trade on this list. IUU fishing was mentioned yesterday. Illegal logging, also very, very large, somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion a year. And crude oil theft. We heard from Mr. Mustafa yesterday from Nigeria, who estimated 300,000 barrels per day stolen out of Nigeria alone. So Nigeria is essentially the epicenter of the illegal oil trade. Actually, GFI did an analysis of the illegal oil trade in Nigeria in 2013. Our estimate was 230,000 barrels a day, so either we were conservative or the problem has gotten worse over the last several years. Other types of, or estimates of illicit flows, there isn't a really good, credible estimate for grand corruption. This is government officials stealing from government accounts. The World Bank put out an estimate about 10 years ago of between $20 and $40 billion a year. I haven't seen that repeated since. I've seen the number repeated, but I haven't seen the bank come up with a new number, or anyone else for that matter. Tax evasion through profit shifting and other methods. The IMF did a study in March of last year. Christine Lagarde had an opinion article in the Financial Times that put the developing country loss at $200 billion a year. And then trade misinvoicing. This is the area GFI focuses on in particular. We put out several country reports, but we also put out an annual report that looks at the value gap for all developing and emerging market countries. Our newest report will be out later in this month. And our estimate will be somewhere around $800 billion for 2017. That's the year we have the best data. Actually, it's probably closer to $820 billion. And we have sort of a rough estimate of the revenue loss to governments related to that value gap. And that would be about 18% of the value gap. Now, I will caution that that is based on about a half a dozen country studies we've done over the last 2 years when we've estimated losses in income tax, VAT, and customs duties. And the average for those 6 countries was about 18%. So it's a very small sample size. It's certainly not definitive, but it gives you sort of an order of magnitude number. And I think that's the key point to make here, is that these are order of magnitude numbers. Illicit money, illicit trade, illicit financial flows are meant to be hidden. So there are no direct data sets that are easy to use and identify. So we're looking at orders of magnitude. You will never get precision But I should say that the estimates are good enough on which to base policy. If our numbers were half as large, if the IMF number on income tax evasion were half as large, the policy prescriptions would not change. And as a matter of fact, we think our numbers are conservative. There are things that you cannot count. You cannot count goods smuggling. You cannot count bulk cash smuggling. We cannot estimate trade misinvoicing that is uses same invoice faking, that is collusion between the importer and the exporter on an artificially low price. We can't detect that. So while the numbers may appear to be large, we think that they are probably conservative. So how do you get, what is needed to improve the quality of the statistics? Well, more transparency. Transparency of country budgets and expenditures would be a way forward to address the issue of grand corruption. What should they be spending and what did they actually spend? The International Budget Partnership in Washington has been working on budget transparency in the developing world for years. They do excellent work. I think there should be a lot more effort to try to get governments to be far more transparent about their spending. Income tax evasion, full participation in country-by-country reporting by multinationals is key. The issue with this is that as the requirement now stands, corporations only have to report their country-by-country numbers to their home tax authority. When this was originally discussed back around 2013-14, the idea was that corporations would actually put their country-by-country reports on their websites, and I think that should perhaps be the next step in the process. There are many stakeholders that would be very interested in those numbers. They should not be privy just to tax authorities. And as far as trade misinvoicing, we believe that every country should publicly list all their imports and exports. A couple of years ago, Ethiopia actually did this. You could go on their customs website and see thousands of lines of Excel spreadsheet data on what was imported and exported, the HS code, the quantity, the value, the description. It was stripped of company information, so there was no proprietary information given out, but very useful. Quick overview of what trade misinvoicing definition is. We talk to a lot of Customs Department officials, high-level commissioners general of customs in developing countries, and we found an interesting trend over the last few years. We've had 4 different commissioners general of customs tell us that their own internal estimate is that 80% of import invoices are fraudulent. It's massive. It goes well beyond anything we would ever have estimated. Now, that doesn't mean that every country has a problem that large, but this is information we didn't even ask them for. They offered it up. So it kind of goes to the issue of just the magnitude of this problem. A quick case study. We did a report on Egypt last year. It's difficult to get the estimated impact of illicit trade on development, but we've tried to, as a proxy, use what we know about trade misinvoicing to give an idea of what the impact may be. So value gap we found for Egypt in 2016 was $8.5 billion. That's 10% of their total trade, with an estimated revenue loss. That's income tax, VAT, and customs duties at $1.6 billion. And then we compared them to, we used previous spending by the Egyptian government in various areas that are covered by the SDGs. And here's some of the numbers. $500,000 they could have spent on SDG 1 poverty, $500,000 on SDG 8, $80 million on climate, SDG 13, 144 on SDG 15, and $208 million SDG 16, and the remainder on various other SDG targets. So certainly has substantial impact. I think I'm going to go quickly to this slide. This is not an exhaustive list of policy things that have been done over the last few years, but it does show progress. Beneficial ownership is the key component of illicit financial flows and illicit trade. By keeping companies secret, you can move, hide, and launder money with impunity. The Panama Papers is basically pointing this out. I couldn't mention this any more strongly. There has to be full beneficial ownership registries globally to really get at this problem. Quickly on to our GF Trade Risk Assessment Tool. We launched this in 2016. We've had 2 governments use it. One is a current customer. The way this works is we have the most up-to-date trade data from 46 of the largest trading countries in the world. We cover about 70% of global trade. And what the governments are able to do is put information from an invoice they have into our system, and it allows them to determine immediately whether it's priced within a normal range of variation. This slide, I'll just talk about the right half of the slide. The yellow colored diamond that's way to the left of the green diamond on that top whisker chart shows the price. The yellow diamond is the price on the invoice versus the average price, which is that green diamond. So they know visually immediately whether the goods are priced correctly or not. If they see something like this, they can immediately collect the proper amount of customs duties and VAT. And last slide, this is a 3-month snapshot of real-world use of our tool in the middle of last year. The developing country that used it found $100 million in underpriced imports in that 3-month period, and that was with only moderate use of the tool. So it gives an indication of how effective this can be in helping governments collect more revenue for the SDGs. Last point would be that I've been working on this since 2006 when nobody knew what an illicit financial flow was. We've had a tremendous amount of understanding and policy movement, better data, better analysis, and now some technical tools are being developed. So lots of progress, but a lot of work to go. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think the use of that tool comes across as a very useful and practical development in terms of tracking some of these flows. Thank you. We turn now to Wendy Lora Perez, who's been so patient in waiting till the end. Wendy is the 2020 president of the Financial Action Task Force of Latin America. Its acronym in Spanish is GAFILAT. She is the General Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit of the Dominican Republic and the National Coordinator and Technical Secretary of the National Committee Against Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism. She is a Dominican lawyer. She has a master's degree in law and international relationships. She has specialized in criminal sciences, and she has had more than 16 years of experience in the exercise of several areas of law, mainly criminal investigation, litigation, economic law, and prevention and prosecution of money laundering and financing of terrorism. Wendy has been a member of the Public Prosecutor's Office since 2006. She's been in charge of important criminal proceedings in the field of money laundering and drug trafficking, and has promoted the strengthening of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing prevention in the stock market when she was the Superintendent of Securities for 2 years. Thank you, Wendy. Over to you.
Muchas gracias por la invitación a este importante foro. Al ser la última, quizás bastaría con decir que estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que han expuesto mis compañeros y dejarlo hasta ahí. Sin embargo, voy a tratar de aportar un poquito a lo que ya hemos conversado. Y es que cuando hablamos de contrabando, de flujos ilícitos, es muy importante tener en cuenta que nada de esto se realiza sin que tenga un fin económico detrás. Y evidentemente que con los controles que se han intentado colocar en el mundo para impedir que esos flujos ilícitos se integren a la economía, es importante entonces conocer cuáles son las prácticas que utilizan los lavadores de activos para que ese dinero efectivamente pueda reintegrarse. De nada serviría el contrabando, la falsificación de una factura o inclusive la trata y tráfico de personas si eso no tuviera una retribución económica. De ahí en cuanto que es relevante conocer cómo se realizan estas actividades para poder entonces controlar que ese flujo ilícito no se integre a la economía. Vamos a hablar específicamente del caso latinoamericano, haciendo un repaso por presentar la situación que hoy tienen los países, sobre todo que ya han sido evaluados en la cuarta ronda de evaluación de GAFI o que tienen evaluaciones de riesgos ya aprobadas. Vamos a describir un poquito, aunque ya se ha hablado algo, de las tipologías y las señales de alerta que pueden haber con los casos de contrabando. Vamos a hablar de qué proyectos tenemos para fortalecer el tema en la región y como último punto, hablar un poquito de los avances que ha presentado la República Dominicana en este tema. Evidentemente que el concepto de contrabando nos habla de cómo se orquesta toda una red para evitar el control de la autoridad. Solo con ese punto podemos decir que tiene una similitud relevantísima cuando lo comparamos con el lavado de activos. El lavado de activos son las actividades que busca que esos fondos, producto de una actividad delictual, se integren a la economía. Y el primer punto para eso es evitar también la supervisión y el control que tienen los estados para que esto sea así. Solo que en el paso del lavado de activos se ha integrado al sector privado para el fortalecimiento de ese control y son las actividades financieras que hemos llamado sujeto obligado, que tienen que contar con unas políticas para que dentro de la actividad comercial que realicen eviten que los flujos ilícitos lleguen a ellos. Así que no podemos negar una relación indisoluble que existe entre comercio, contrabando, flujos ilícitos y el lavado de activos. Hoy por hoy, ya los han dicho mis compañeros que expusieron previamente, el crimen organizado está más organizado que nunca. Por ende, es perentorio, es necesario que las autoridades que buscan el control de estas actividades también se organicen en pos de ese combate. Herramientas globales. El GAFI, que es la organización intergubernamental creada en 1989, fundamentalmente genera las reglas o las pautas o recomendaciones para que a nivel mundial podamos organizar los esfuerzos para combatir tanto el lavado de dinero, financiamiento del terrorismo, como los delitos precedentes. En ese punto hay grupos regionales al estilo GAFI que se adecúan a esas mismas reglas. En el caso nuestro está el Grupo de Acción Financiera de Latinoamérica, que integra 17 países. Dentro de esas recomendaciones que ha establecido el GAFI, la recomendación 3 es la que indica a los países que el contrabando debe de ser considerado precedente de lavado de activos. Y cuando hablamos de considerarlo precedente, es que justamente los ingresos que produzcan de esta actividad puedan ser perseguidas en todas las jurisdicciones como lavado de activos. No obstante, la recomendación que parece tener más cercano a la actividad de las aduanas es la recomendación 32, que es la que te habla del transporte transfronterizo de efectivo o la necesidad de declarar el transporte de efectivo cuando sobrepasa alguna cantidad del umbral. El tema que subyace en esta recomendación es que ha sido creada para evitar los flujos ilícitos o lícitos para el financiamiento del terrorismo, no necesariamente para temas que tengan que ver con contrabando. Y muchas veces la labor única que realizan las aduanas con tema de lavado de activos es esa. Entendemos que el frenar el transporte transfronterizo es suficiente para de esta forma frenar el lavado de activos. Y muchas veces esa interdicción que realizan las aduanas, que en el general de los casos es netamente administrativa, corta una investigación relevante, como establecía una de las ponentes anteriores, para poder establecer de dónde viene ese dinero. Y nos quedamos entonces muchas veces con solo la puntita del iceberg. Y es que donde hay dinero, 15, 20, 30 mil o la cantidad que sea de dólares, evidentemente que hay una actividad delictiva que está generando esas divisas. Se hace un comiso administrativo y perdemos la oportunidad de seguir ese flujo ilícito. Hasta el momento han sido evaluados 11 países de los que integran el Grupo de Acción Financiera de Latinoamérica, y los resultados que se han obtenido en estas evaluaciones en materia de contrabando y control de flujos ilícitos son los siguientes. En todas las jurisdicciones evaluadas, e inclusive en las no evaluadas que ya cuentan con una evaluación nacional de riesgos, se ha concluido que el contrabando es un delito de riesgo significativo para ser utilizado como lavado de activos. Lo que implica entonces es que todos hemos convenido en que la actividad ilícita de contrabando es relevante para nuestras jurisdicciones, está pasando y está creando o generando flujos importantes. Tomando en cuenta las distintas particularidades de las jurisdicciones, ha quedado este riesgo en alto, medio o bajo. En ese punto, todas las jurisdicciones consideran que al contrabando como un delito precedente de lavado. En todas las jurisdicciones miembro de GAFILAT ya se cuenta entonces con herramientas jurídicas para perseguir esos flujos como lavado de activos precedente del contrabando. En la mayoría de las jurisdicciones, la posibilidad del comiso por transporte transfronterizo de efectivo sin declarar se encuentran establecidos en las leyes de aduanas o en las leyes de contrabando. Y muchas veces incluso hay una duplicidad. Tanto está en las leyes de contrabando como en las leyes de lavado de activos, lo que genera muchas veces o duplicidad de esfuerzos o esfuerzos contradictorios. Como les decía anteriormente, un tema es poder administrativamente cortar estos flujos y otro es investigar el origen de los mismos. Asimismo, este tema puede incidir también en el tratamiento de los casos. Las estadísticas de los casos, sin embargo, aunque todos entendemos que es un riesgo que está en nuestras jurisdicciones, que se presenta y que tiene relevancia, todavía no son suficientes como para poder decir que estamos siendo efectivos en el combate del lavado de activos proveniente de las actividades de contrabando. En ese caso, el GAFILAT realizó un estudio de tipologías del 2017 al 2018 que, como viene dado por información que ha sido proporcionada por los coordinadores nacionales de las jurisdicciones, la información es bastante buena, o por lo menos tiene un grado de fiabilidad importante. Se concluyó entonces en ese estudio de tipología, solamente voy a mencionar algunas porque ya mis compañeros han hablado en algunos de los casos. Por ejemplo, en una zona fronteriza, los comerciantes del rubro de la cebolla adulteraron los permisos para transportar estas hortalizas en territorio nacional con el objetivo de realizar varios viajes consecutivos utilizando vehículos de diferentes propietarios y negociar así la hortaliza en un mercado nacional, obteniendo con esta actividad un porcentaje alto de utilidad y recibiendo solamente dinero en efectivo. Las amenazas que se detectaron allí fueron corrupción, soborno, contrabando, delitos fiscales, transporte ilícito de dinero y delincuencia organizada. Para poder perseguir este caso, se hizo en cooperación con otros países miembros de GAFILAT. Y esto creo que es una constante en los casos de contrabando. Difícilmente se da un caso de contrabando que no se dé asociado a una actividad de corrupción o por lo menos de falta de control en las aduanas y muchas veces el contubernio o el soborno de las autoridades. Por ende, no voy a ver las demás tipologías porque tienen mucho parecido en ese punto. Señales de alerta. Las señales de alerta que se reflejaron en ese estudio fueron las siguientes: cantidades comercializadas de producción en la baja zona, diferencias entre ingresos declarados y autoridad tributaria y lo declarado en aduana, otorgamiento de permisos emitidos en una misma dependencia y registro como productores sin que tengan realmente los terrenos cultivables para ser productor. Voy a pasar rapidito. La OEA y la UNCTAD publicó también un estudio y señaló como tipologías las siguientes: sobrefacturación y subfacturación de bienes y servicios, adulteración a la descripción de bienes y servicios y utilización de cuentas embudo. Buenas prácticas en la región, capacitaciones conjuntas sobre el tema, estudios regionales y sectoriales, intercambio de información de inteligencia vía plataformas seguras de intercambio de información, ejercicio de transporte transfronterizo de efectivo, tanto bilaterales como multilaterales, reuniones periódicas de las redes de intercambio de información y recuperación de activos. Se concuerda entonces que también las zonas libres de comercio poseen un enorme potencial para las organizaciones criminales y los grupos terroristas, y en Latinoamérica tenemos varias zonas importantes, por ende el riesgo en eso aumenta. Con respecto a los avances que ha presentado República Dominicana, voy a simplificar simplemente en 2 puntos. A partir del 2018 tenemos una nueva ley de comercio ilícito en donde pretendemos mejorar tanto los indicadores de transparencia como de la información de la que dispone el país, y pertenecemos a varios grupos de intercambio de información con otras aduanas que nos permiten en tiempo real obtener la información de, como se señalaba anteriormente, del valor real de los productos y el valor al que llegan las facturas. Estamos a su disposición, espero que le haya sido de provecho la presentación.